Japan's former prime minister is laid to rest. The country remains in shock after its longest-serving post-war leader is shot and killed while delivering a campaign speech. With his bold, sometimes controversial economic and foreign policy, how will Japan and the world remember Shinzo Abe? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Shinzo Abe. In Japan, gun violence is extremely rare. So when Shinzo Abe was fatally shot while campaigning for a fellow party member in the western city of Nara, many just couldn't believe it. The former Japanese prime minister was delivering a speech ahead of parliamentary elections when a gunman fired 2 shots from a homemade firearm.
I was praying that his life would be saved, but despite that, I came to learn of his death. It is truly regrettable. I am lost for words.
Shinzo Abe was one of Japan's most influential leaders and a giant on the world stage. Throughout his almost 10 years in power, he met with countless heads of state, many of whom have paid their respects.
Today, I'm keeping his wife and family in my prayers, and the United States is standing in solidarity with our ally, Japan.
Today is a day of irreplaceable loss and unbearable pain for me. My close friend and former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is no more. Abe was not just my friend, he was also India's trusted friend.
I really wanted to express to the widow of Shinzo Abe, to all of his family and all of the Japanese people, France's condolences, and to express our friendship and our affection.
Japan has lost a true patriot and a true leader. And Australia has lost a true friend.
The man suspected of Abe's assassination is 41-year-old Tetsuya Yamagami. Unemployed, he formerly served in the Japanese Navy and says he shot Shinzo Abe over his links to a religious organization that Japanese police refused to name. It's since been shown the former prime minister had no links to that unnamed organization. On Tuesday, Shinzo Abe was laid to rest at this Buddhist temple in Tokyo. The funeral itself was kept private, with only close families and friends in attendance, but outside, huge crowds were in mourning.
There was a sense of security when he was the prime minister and in charge of the country. We felt safe with him in charge. I was really supporting him, so this is really quite unfortunate.
Well, Shinzo Abe was a transformational leader. He crafted decisive, sometimes controversial, economic and foreign policy. While some hailed what came to be known as Abenomics as a game changer, others say it fell short. Yes, there was growth, but not at the rate Japan had once seen, and certainly not at the rate the government had projected. Then there was his foreign policy. Following the Second World War, Japan adopted a pacifist constitution. Shinzo Abe wanted to change that. The conservative premier expanded the military, significantly increased defense spending, and was rarely afraid of challenging his rivals, even after leaving office.
An adventure in military affairs, if pursued by such a huge economy like China's, could be suicidal, to say the least. We must urge them not to pursue territorial expansion and refrain from provoking, often bullying, their neighbors, because it should harm their own interests.
So how will Japan and the world remember Shinzo Abe, and did his bold policies fundamentally change Japan? Here now to debate that are from Tokyo, Ichiro Fujisaki. He was Japan's deputy foreign minister and ambassador to the United States, the UN, and the World Trade Organization. From New York is Dr. Nancy Snow, a visiting professor at Tsinghua University and a former Abe Fellow at the Keio University. And also from Tokyo, Seijiro Takeshita, a professor of management and information at the University of Shizuoka. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, it's almost always the case when a world leader passes that people talk about their achievements, you know, to the point of exaggeration, almost out of respect. But Shinzo Abe really was a titan of Japanese politics because he didn't shy away from making game-changing, controversial decisions. Ambassador, is it correct to say his legacy will loom pretty large, especially over Japan's place in the world?
Yes, I do think so. First of all, I've known him for about 40 years because his father was a foreign minister and he was a private secretary. So even before he was becoming a politician, I've known him. And I've sort of known him for a long time. And I think his points can be sort of separated to three parts. One is security policy. That's a legacy. He made a security legislature and made U.S.-Japan relations very strong. And even during President Trump period, when other countries had problems, I think Abe managed that very skillfully. Second, sort of wide scope, and he has tried to bring in Quad, TPP, Indo-Pacific. That was all coming from TPP was not Japan's initiation, but when America failed to pursue, Japan came in and continued with CPTPP. So, and he befriended with many leaders, Modi, Erdogan, Australia, and we had some problem with Putin as well. Had some problem with China and Korea, but China sort of came along as well in the end. And also he did Olympic Games, brought in the Olympic Games. So all these was his, I think, legacy in diplomacy. In economic policy, I think it's still controversial, but he sort of changed the mindset of people, try not to be too pessimistic and try to be optimistic, so that the stock price has tripled since he took over. And so that kind of change was brought about by him. And he was very popular, down to earth and warm personality. But there were problems as well politically, and I'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about all three of the areas, especially that you mentioned. But let me turn to Nancy Snow. I mean, is it hard to exaggerate really his position in Japan's global influence? Let's put it that way. He was different from other leaders before, was he not?
Oh, he's absolutely different for Japan. And as the ambassador says, not only for Japan, but for the world. That wider lens, that wanting to make Japan a first-tier country, to stay a first-tier country. He didn't want it to slip. This was after the lost decade, or decades, as we call it. Japan was known really as an economic giant, but it wasn't known as a political giant. And Abe, coming from the political dynasty that he does, wanted to change that. He had a vision, he stuck to that vision, and it did deal a lot with security, and he made some changes there. Now we talk a lot about Japan's constitution and the possible revision of the constitution with Article 9 or Article 96. But for me, as a public diplomacy, strategic communications analyst, he is a king in this arena. He really worked with his staff, with his team, to give messages about Japan that really stuck, not only Abenomics, but Womenomics. From Womenomics came the World Association for Women, these conferences that went on for years. People really noted Japan through the lens of Shinzo Abe. He's the nation brand face of Japan, and he will remain so. The Abe legacy will now be discussed amongst scholars, journalists. And you know, the saddest part is that we won't have his reflection of looking back, the books that he likely would have written, the scholars with whom he would have sat down and talked about his vision. All of that is lost. It gives me goosebumps to think about that, because even I would have liked to have sat down with him if I had ever had that opportunity. And I say that as someone who was often critical of Abe administration policies, particularly maybe going too far with revising the Constitution. I think the peace Constitution has done Japan very well for 70 years.
It's amazing how much really has been lost when you look at the future and what he would have also done post-politics, writing, everything. But Sujito, I want to move on to you because we've talked so much about Abenomics. You know, it was obviously a term coined around his very name because at a time of real economic strife, very clear guidance was needed. So to what extent do you think Abenomics actually rescued Japan's economy?
Well, if we bring ourselves back to that time, it was very clear that Japan was suffering, particularly the Japanese corporations and the exporters, because of the strong yen conditions and, long deflationary conditions, which also really dampened the sentiment of, the Japanese as a whole, and not only corporations, but Japan as a whole. And he basically gave a jab in the arm, in my opinion, by conducting, the first era of Abenomics, which is monetary easing, along with, BOJ, which was amazing because it did lead to weakening the yen. It gave so much breathing room to Japanese exporters who tend to be the leaders and the frontliners in making capital expenditure. And characteristic of the Japanese economy is that unless a corporation does well, the people aren't going to spend. That's usually the case. So we needed to see the capital expenditure and corporate activities come back, which is exactly what he induced through his first era of Abenomics. Now, his miscalculation was that there was an expectation that the companies would pass that on as a wage increase, and then private consumption would basically flourish. But that didn't happen, in spite of the fact that the companies have shown record high profits. So this is something that needs to be tackled by the new regime. Many people criticize about his second and third arrow not being realized, but structural transition, for example, takes a long time, and trajectory of the second and especially the third arrow is much longer. What I can clearly say though is that Mr. Abe has clearly set up a stage plateau for Japan to continue with this policies, this Abenomics, which includes, as Nancy pointed out, womenomics, which is becoming very frequently seen in Japan, along with SDGs. And there's a lot of other possible legacies that's also correlated with his political, issues, which is giving the Japanese industry a very good positioning advantage.
It's interesting when you talk about those second and third arrows and their trajectory, and we'll see if they'll be vindicated in the end, if this policy will indeed pan out as was planned. But it looks to be on a positive trajectory, if I'm not mistaken, from the reports that I've seen myself. But Ambassador, let me come back to you. Shinzo Abe's foreign policy was among the most controversial because it changed the trajectory there of Japan's, decades-old pacifist policy. It angered a lot of people who felt it shouldn't change. But do you think that decision to take a more defensive posture against China in particular will be vindicated in the end?
I think he had a foresight, and that was proved to be right, seen from what China is doing or Russia is doing now. So now people think that, he was right. It's not like a prophet, but about economy, the biggest thing is that he challenged the psychology of balancing the budget. It was always the very top priority. The Ministry of Finance and politicians have been affected by that, but this politician defied that. And I think that was a big thing, which had never happened before. Lastly, the clear vision that he had, as Nancy Snow said, was very important. That was in diplomacy, economy, and everywhere. He showed the vision. That was very unique. But the problem, as I said, was that because his reign was 8 years and very long in Japan, the longest serving prime minister, that has brought some political problems as well in the end, because those people surrounded him, made him as the so strong leader, so they read his mind and tried to do favor, and that went a little too much to that. So in the end, that has a little caused a cost in his, I think, legacy as well.
Okay, very interesting. I want to talk further. Nancy Snow, let me move on to you about the foreign policy that Shinzo Abe worked so hard and some say so controversially on. Some Japanese were very bothered, particularly by his, and I'll put this in quotes, relationship with Donald Trump. So tell us if you think it was one of actual like and admiration, or was this a kind of strategic obligation because the position he was taking in Japan's new place on the global stage and its historic relationship with the United States?
You know, I celebrated that when Abe reached out to Trump, and he was the first head of state who went to Trump Tower in New York. That made him someone that world leaders then wanted to consult with when they were dealing with the Trump administration over 4 years. So it's both strategy, but it's also likability. They had a kinship. They were able to communicate with each other. Whatever you think of Trump as a polarizing figure, that's a good thing for Japan if Japan can make its narrative known to the head of the United States at that time. This US-Japan relationship is critical. There's nothing like it in the world. Let me add something too, having to do with his length of service. The fact that Abe now is associated with Japan, this plays out when I go to the grocery or if I talk about living in Japan, which I've done over the last few days and did a lot of interviews, and I'll have the cashier say, you know that Abe, he was a good man. There's no other prime minister of Japan that someone who may not follow politics, much less in Japan, would be acknowledging than Shinzo Abe. That's what he meant to Japan. It's just phenomenal, and I'll miss him as a figurehead. Again, despite the criticism that I might have, my worry with too much tinkering of Japan's constitution is that that will play into China and Russia's pushback to say, see, Japan's image is that of a peaceful nation, non-threatening, and look at it now. Look at it going more proactive in its military posture. That's where there's a need for greater, stronger global communications from the government of Japan. They have to frame this in light of being the trusted partner to the global community.
Go ahead, Ambassador. I see you had a comment on that.
One word. You said, touched upon Abe's very right-wing policy or a change of the constitution. But in fact, he was a very practical conservative. He didn't really push those things which people didn't really like. So about constitution, he was saying it, but he didn't really started the process that quickly. Or as for Mr. Trump, I think Japanese people were really appreciative, as Nancy Snow said, that he was managing the relations pretty well with Mr. Trump. So he was a very, in a way, very practical politician, I think. Not only imaginative or whatever, he was had a vision, but also very practical conservative.
Okay, so Jiro, you're on the same page there. I at least saw you nodding your head in agreement, if I wasn't misunderstanding. This practical conservative take on policy, will it serve Japan, do you think, especially on the diplomacy front and Japan's positioning now in the region, especially as an adversary to China? Sejiro, go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think one of the positive feature that he had was, I think, to summarize it, he was a very likable man. That's why he was able to bridge ties with both Mr. Obama and Mr. Trump. And as Nancy also portrayed, how the civilians took him. Obviously, he was a very likable man, a very practical man as well. And therefore, he has built so many bridges while other bridges were burning down. I think that is his very positive legacy, which has contributed, into various foreign policies, which gave a lot of very good plateau for the Japanese exporters and corporations to work on. There were lots of homeworks to be done. I don't think he did enough in trying to cope with the possible, inflationary fears that we're getting right now. This, energy crisis that we're likely to face, and we're much more vulnerable than other countries in this case, which hasn't been really argued enough in Japan. There are lots of homeworks that were undone. But that said, I mean, he's done more than one can imagine, or else he wouldn't have been a prime minister for 2,800 days. He had a full backup from, the economic side as well, because again, he was a very decisive leader, and at the same time, he was a very likable man. So he had both the charms of being practical and nice,
Right.
which often tend to be, mutually exclusive, but in his case, it was mutually inclusive.
So, Sujiro, quickly on those domestic challenges you're talking about,
Yeah,
the LDP now has a majority with its Komeito partner. Um,
yeah, yeah.
will they be able to maintain the kind of unity they had under Shinzo Abe? Because he is, let's be honest, he's a tough act to follow as a leader. Now that they've
Well,
really lost his presence there, will they be able to maintain that unity in Parliament to keep tackling these many challenges that
yeah, yeah.
Japan's still facing? Go ahead.
Well, that's my biggest worry, actually. That's the biggest question that I've got right now. He was very, eloquent, as the ambassador was saying, to bring back the power back to the politicians, away from the bureaucrats, which was very good, especially in long-term structural transition that we need to make. And we're not going to have big election for next 3 years, so this is a golden era for these people to conduct this. But to lose a leader of conservative LDPs like that of Mr. Shinzo Abe could possibly emerge into a division within the LDP. And if that happens, the scenario of utilizing this golden 3 years to conduct structural reform would become very difficult. Decision making would alter. So I would like to think that Mr. Kishida would be able to sustain the leadership that Mr. Abe had portrayed. But with Mr. Abe, as you pointed out, it is a very, very difficult act to follow, I think.
Ambassador, go ahead.
Yes, I think he had a very clear vision, but at the same time, he was very down to earth. And why? Because he was so sure of himself, his leadership, his personality, his background, his power, political power. So that was the key thing. He was so sure. For example, you remember that he disguised that Mario in Rio de Janeiro Olympic Games. If you're not so sure of yourself, you wouldn't do that. He was so sure. One more thing. However, people had 8 years of Abe, and really, people were thinking of change, need to change. So that's why Kishida has 65% support rate, which is a lot higher than Abe. And so we have to admit that Abe was such a likable person and strong leader. But in anywhere, like after Mr. Obama, Americans wanted Trump, and after Trump, they wanted Biden. That goes like that in Japan as well, if I may say.
Okay. Nancy Snow, we're down to our last 90 seconds. I'd just like to get your final thoughts.
You know, he had health problems going back to when he was 13 years old. And he struggled with his health throughout his life. Despite that, as the others have said, he had an incredible vision. He had a path. He's really arguably the greatest public servant of Japan that I've known in my lifetime. My entire Abe fellowship coincided with Shinzo Abe's second term as prime minister. And I'll miss him terribly. He died the same age as his father. And last year, when he turned 67, he reflected on living longer. And I'm sure he was looking forward to, after this election, where his faction did so well, talking more to reporters. Again, as I said, putting down his thoughts and his reflections. That's lost now. And it's a terrible loss for the country and the world.
Are you hopeful the LDP will do his legacy justice from this point forward?
Well, I do think it is part of nation brand Japan. There's no question. The Abe legacy is a positive, and they have to utilize that in their messaging going forward, especially in the diplomacy. I think that's really his strength, was foreign policy and diplomacy, as the son of the foreign minister, who was once the longest serving foreign minister, who would have been prime minister. So Abe fulfilled that dream of his father. And again, we care a lot about Japan, have to carry this forward.
Dr. Nancy Snow, I'm going to have to give you the final word. We're completely out of time. For this edition of The Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.